much for joining us. As Naoka said, I am Kieran. I work directly for the Disclosure and Barring Service. I am a regional outreach advisor, and my remit or my region is Greater London. So essentially, I'm a point of contact for anything to do with the DBS. And what we're going to do today is go through the session with you all, which is about the DBS services that we provide, and hopefully that will bring a better understanding of services that we have and essentially a little bit the support that I can offer as well for you all. So just for a little bit of housekeeping, if we could just have mics on mute, that would be great, just to help with any interference. That would be really appreciated. I am using quite a dated laptop, so I have to be honest with you. So my video will be turned off, so you won't be able to see me, and I probably won't be able to see you either. But if anyone does have any questions, Naoka, please let me know if someone puts a hand up, or if there's any questions that you'd like to put in the chat. That's absolutely fine as well. Or you can just take yourselves off mute and say Kieran, and that's fine too. Alternatively, we will hopefully have some time at the end as well for some questions. So I hope that's all okay. At some point at the very beginning, I will be showing a video. So if anyone can't hear it or anything, do let me know, and I'll see if we can fix that as well. But I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to get set up now. So just bear with me a few minutes. Well, not even a few minutes, really, a few seconds.
Can I request everyone to put in their name, organization, and maybe email ID in the chat if you'd like to collaborate or interact with each other post the event. And very personal questions or special questions can be discussed with Kiran directly. Do send me an email as this session is recorded. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Naoka. Right. Okay. So as I said, so this is a disclosure and barring service overview. So we're going to talk about the DBS and the services that we have. So there we go. So the objectives of today's good morning session is basically to look at the DBS, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a good idea of the DBS, the services that we have, and how those services can be used to form part of safer recruitment practices. So today's workshop, we're going to be looking at the different levels of DBS checks and their eligibility. I'm sure you all know, but there are 4 different levels, and they all have their different eligibility requirements, and they all disclose different levels of information. So we'll have a look at that. We'll have a look at the DBS update service, which is our online subscription service. We'll also have a look at what information is actually removed from a DBS certificate before you as an employment or as a recruitment manager view it. So there is sometimes some information that is filtered from a DBS certificate. We're going to have a look at what regulated activity is. And as you will very soon see, regulated activity is what allows somebody to be able to access our highest level of DBS check, which is the enhanced DBS with a barred list. We're also going to have a little look at the barring process as well, the barring referral routes that we have at the DBS. So the barring process, the barring element of what the DBS does is also equally important as the disclosure side, and we will have a look at when it is important to make that barring referral, and essentially what also makes a good barring referral. So I hope that's everything that you were hoping to gain from today's session. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction to the DBS. So I'm sure a lot of you are well aware of who we are and what we do, previously known as the Criminals Records Bureau, but now we are the Disclosure and Barring Service. But when it comes to recruiting or people to work with or volunteer with vulnerable groups, it is important that the people who are recruited are suitable to work in that role from a safeguarding perspective. We want to know that the vulnerable adults and children that we care for are going to be safe from harm when they are receiving a service, and that's whether it's from a paid staff member or from a volunteer, and that is why the DBS exists. So the purpose of the DBS is to protect the public by helping employers make safer recruitment decisions and by barring those individuals who pose a risk to vulnerable groups from working in certain roles. The DBS aims to make sure that employers have all the necessary information available to them to help them make those suitability decisions about the people that they're looking to employ, and we do that through our disclosure checks. The DBS can also take the next steps to legally bar an individual if they do pose a risk to vulnerable adults and children. And this is all in the aim of supporting that DBS vision, which is about making recruitment safer. So in 2020, the DBS launched their 5-year strategy, and this details our key ambitions for the next 5 years. The main things we want to focus on is our profile, our quality, and our people. We want to be seen as a visible, trusted, and influential organisation that provides an outstanding quality of service to all our customers and partners. Safeguarding is at the heart of everything we do at the DBS, and we believe that the delivery of this strategy will help us to improve services, develop as an organisation, and support our contribution to the safeguarding community. So where does the role of the DBS stem from? Where are our roots? So thinking specifically about the role of the DBS, we are responsible for the delivery of disclosure and borrowing functions on behalf of the UK government. So we operate our disclosure functions for England, Wales, the Isle of Man, Channel Islands, and that's all under Part 5 of the Police Act of 1997. And that's supported by the legislation that you can see here on this slide. So the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, and the Protection of Freedoms Act, they all set out certain things like the levels of DBS checks that are available, what types of information is disclosed on the different levels of check, and the eligibility criteria that has to be met for an individual to be eligible to apply for those levels of DBS checks. We also operate the borrowing functions for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and that's under the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, including the Northern Ireland Order and the Protection of Freedoms Act as well. And again, they also set out the processes and procedures that have to be followed, as well as the criteria that has to be met for us to legally bar an individual. Often people feel that the DBS is a law unto themselves, and they can decide what information is disclosed, or they can decide who gets barred. And obviously, of course, we do make those decisions, but ultimately we are governed by law. So there is legal basis for everything that we do, and we have to make sure that we adhere to those legalities as well. And this is what basically governs our functions and our processes. So the DBS and you, in terms of how many applications and certificates are we getting? So in the last financial year, we issued 3.5 million standard and enhanced disclosures. Over 90% of those were for enhanced checks, and around about 22% were for volunteer positions. More than 90% of those contain no information, kind of highlighting the number of applications that we get, and the number of certificates that we then send out with information on it is relatively low in comparison. However, where there is information on a DBS certificate, we never advocate that that should be seen as a pass or fail. It should be, that information should be taken alongside other safer recruitment processes and practices, and they should be used to make that informed decision about how suitable that individual is for that role. We have 1.9 million people subscribed to the update service, and that's our online subscription service, which I will talk about a little bit later. We also process around about 2.2 million basic disclosures per year, and that's our lowest level of DBS check. In terms of our barred list, as of March 2021, there were more than 81,000 people on either one or both barred lists. So that's a lot of people who have been barred from working with either vulnerable adults and or children. And we make sure that our systems and our processes are of that high quality, that these checks are carried out to that highest level. So thinking about the safeguarding environment, where exactly does the DBS fit in? Now, I've got a little video here, and hopefully it's going to work well, and but I might have to stop sharing and then share again. So just bear with me 2 seconds. Hopefully everyone should see that. Right, so hopefully everyone's back. And that gave you a good idea about the safeguarding environment and the different types of organisations that are all within it, all working together, all looking to support and safeguard those that are most vulnerable in our society. And the DBS basically is a small but vital element of that environment. If you imagine almost if the DBS didn't exist in that respect, you know, how would we know who it is that we are employing? So the DBS is there to support that safeguarding environment and to making sure that those people, you know, who are not suitable to be working with vulnerable groups are prevented from doing so. But that's where we fit into that safeguarding environment. So moving on, we're going to look first at disclosure. So disclosure checks, I'm sure, is something that you are all very familiar with. This is where you complete application forms for potential volunteers, and you may issue these through an umbrella body or through yourselves if you are a registered body. And then the DBS will send out those certificates directly to the individual, who should then in turn show to yourselves as volunteer recruitment managers. And those disclosure checks will include information about any past criminal convictions or cautions that individual may have received, so that you as a volunteer manager can make sure that you have the right information about an individual to be able to make a suitability decision on. So DBS checks are a very important part of any recruitment process, but they are only still one part of the whole when it comes to safe recruitment practices. So how can organisations get it right when they are recruiting new staff or volunteers? So it all starts with getting that right level of check at the right time. So to do this, it's always a good idea to have a clear and comprehensive job description. So this will help you and the applicant understand what level of DBS check is allowed. This then even allows you as a volunteer recruiter to seek out that right amount of information from the applicant's history. And this could be information that could affect their job performance and the potential risk if they are working with vulnerable groups. So even before a DBS check is requested, it's important to check their ID documents and their right to work, have a look at their employment history, and try and take references as well to try and gauge a picture of that individual as much as possible. The next step is to act swiftly on certificate information and be prepared when you do receive a certificate with information on it. Even if it is a rare occurrence, it is important to think about how that information relates to the role and your own policies. So depending on what is included in that certificate information, as an organisation, you should know what measures should be in place in order for that applicant to be recruited or employed. So one way to be prepared is to have a recruitment of ex-offenders policy in place, setting out how you will consider different offences. And it doesn't end once that person is in post either. You will have to have the right processes and procedures in place to make sure that you can recognise and act on any harmful behaviour. So having processes in place will make it safer and easier for not only yourselves, but other employees or other volunteers, and will allow them to disclose information that's important. And whistleblowing policies, training and reporting procedures, these are all safer recruitment practices that can also help and aid that as well. If you do find yourself in a situation where safeguarding concern has been raised, then it is important to remove the risk of any future harm. So when somebody is in regulated activity, it is important that they are removed from the role if you consider that there is evidence of harm or a risk of future harm. Keeping accurate records as well is also really vital when it comes to taking any necessary and appropriate action. And if you have to do so, those records are going to be really important. Finally, consider if you should tell the DBS by making a referral. If you have removed somebody from regulated activity because they have harmed or they pose a risk of harm to a vulnerable adult or child, then you have a legal duty to do this. And we will talk about this a little bit more later as well. But essentially, it is a process and it is a cycle, as you can see. It's about making sure that you get those right checks at the right time so that you can make that right suitability decision. And then if there are any safeguarding concerns that arise, you let the DBS know so that the DBS can decide whether this individual should be placed on the barred list or not. And if they are placed on the barred list, then that means that when that individual potentially applies for another role and perhaps it is working with vulnerable people, vulnerable adults or children, then their new employer will know that this individual should not be working with that particular group, and then that individual will be prevented from that access to vulnerable groups. But if the DBS doesn't know, then that new employer won't have any further information either. So it is important, you know, to make sure that we fully complete it in terms of informing the DBS if there are any concerns, so that the next employer can have the accurate information. So the different levels of DBS checks. So we have 4 different levels: the basic, the standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred list check. So before I start, I'm just going to clarify what unspent and spent convictions are, because you're going to see that a lot on this slide and hear those words a lot. So when an individual receives a conviction or a caution, once they've carried out their sentence, there is a period of time after their sentence known as a rehabilitation period. Now, within that rehabilitation period, the conviction or caution they receive is considered to be unspent. Once that rehabilitation period has expired, is completed, is finished, then that conviction or caution is considered to be spent. And that is important for this because it helps to understand those different levels of DBS checks. So if we start with basic, we've got the basic check, and this will disclose any unspent convictions and conditional cautions. So in terms of eligibility for a basic level of DBS check, there is no eligibility. Anybody can apply for a basic DBS check. You yourself can go onto the government website and submit your own DBS check, basic DBS check, if that is what you needed to do. But that is the basic check, basically. There are no requirements for it. There are no restrictions. Anybody can apply for it, and it will disclose any unspent convictions and cautions. Next, we have the standard DBS check. Now, this will disclose any spent and unspent convictions and cautions subject to filtering. So for the standard DBS check, this is for very specific roles that have been outlined in legislation as being eligible for a standard DBS check. Now, examples of these very specific roles are roles in the finance industry, roles in the legal sector, veterinary surgeons, locksmiths, and my personal favorite, football stewards. They can also have a standard DBS check. So as you can see from those examples that I've given you, these are very, very specific roles that have been put in legislation as being eligible for a standard DBS check. This standard DBS check is for those particular roles only. Next, we have the enhanced DBS check. So this will also disclose any spent and unspent convictions and cautions. So the information the DBS receive about spent and unspent convictions and cautions is all from the police national computer. But for the enhanced check and above, as you will see in a little while, this is also a relevant police intelligence also makes a play as well. So if there is information that may not appear on a police national computer, but a local police force may have information about a particular individual, they can include that information on an enhanced check and above, if they feel it's relevant and if they feel it ought to be disclosed because of the role the individual has applied to work in or the workforce that they have applied to work within as well. So that's the benefits of the enhanced DBS check. And that information is really important because for enhanced DBS check, in terms of eligibility, you are looking at roles that are working with children and working with adults. Next, we have the enhanced with barred list check. So this is exactly the same as the enhanced check, including the relevant police intelligence, but this is also where the individual is checked against the children's and or adults barred list, depending on what workforce they will be working in. So when a check against the barred list is carried out, that means that that check is being carried out to see if that individual has been barred from working with that particular workforce or not. And for an enhanced DBS with barred list check, this is for those roles that are considered to be in regulated activity, and we will discuss regulated activity in a little while. So the different levels of check all, as you can see, have prices to them. The standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred list check are free for volunteers, but because there is no eligibility for a basic DBS check, there is a charge even for volunteers with a basic DBS check too. And another thing I'm just going to quickly mention here as well is that often people feel that if it's not an enhanced with barred list check, it would be an enhanced check. And if it's not an enhanced, it would be a standard, and then so forth. That's not the way it works. For some roles, especially those working with children and with vulnerable adults, sometimes if it's not an enhanced with barred list check, it's not an enhanced check, it may go straight to basic. Because as I mentioned earlier, for standard DBS check, it is for very particular specific roles. And if it's not one of those roles, sometimes the only check that may be left is a basic DBS check. So those are the different levels of DBS check. And as you can see, they all have their different eligibility requirements and they all disclose different levels of information as well. So one thing, obviously I mentioned at the very beginning as well, is that sometimes some information is filtered from a DBS certificate. So that before the employer or the recruitment manager views that certificate, some information may be removed from that certificate. So this all came about in 2013 when the Supreme Court ruled that disclosing all spent and unspent convictions was in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the rules are now that a conviction will be filtered from a criminal record certificate if 11 years have gone since the date of the conviction, if it is the person's only conviction and it didn't result in a custodial or a suspended sentence, and it is not on the list or not the DBS list of specified offences that will never be filtered. And these are very serious offences that will include very serious sexual and violent crimes that will never ever be filtered. If that conviction meets those requirements, then that particular conviction would be removed from a DBS certificate before is sent to the individual and before the employer sees it. In terms of cautions and reprimands, a caution for an adult will be filtered after 6 years since the date of the caution, and again, only if it does not appear on the DBS list of specified offences that will never be filtered. Youth cautions are not disclosed on a DBS certificate, but if there is any information that is filtered that a chief police officer feels is relevant to the role, then they can still include it on an enhanced check or above. So those are the DBS filtering rules. So thinking about scenarios when, as a recruitment manager, you receive someone's DBS check, DBS certificate, and there is information on there, how should you respond to that disclosure information? So this slide, we'll just go over some of the things that you can consider. And when you see the certificate, you can consider what that information means and more importantly, what it means in relation to the role that that individual is going to be carrying out and the potential risk that may come with that information. So on the top of this slide, we have regulated activity. Is that individual barred from working in that workforce? And the reason we have this at the top is because if you're employing someone to work in regulated activity and that person is barred from working in that workforce, it will be a criminal offence for you to allow them to carry out that job role. So if an individual is barred, it's a criminal offence for them to offer to work or seek to work in regulated activity in the workforce they are barred from. And it's also a criminal offence for the employer to allow them to work in that workforce. So that's why it's the first thing we consider in terms of the information that can be disclosed on a DBS certificate. If they are barred from that workforce, then that application will end there because that individual cannot work in that particular workforce. Other things you can think about and consider is, are there any legal or regulatory requirements? So for example, some regulators like Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission, they have certain requirements in place that outline what information will make an individual unsuitable to carry out certain roles that they regulate. So if someone is not barred from regulated activity, then it's important to think about, are there any other requirements that might mean that the information disclosed will make that person unsuitable for the role that you are recruiting for. Other things to think about are the age at the time the offence was committed and the seriousness of the offence. So was the applicant particularly young when they were given that conviction, or was it for a minor offence that might not have any relevance to the job role that you are recruiting for? Is there a pattern of offending behaviour? So is the information that's been disclosed an indication that the person had a pattern of offending behaviour? So there were multiple convictions over a span of several years, or is it more of an indication that it might have been a one-off isolated incident? And you can then discuss this with the applicant to understand more. Other things you can think about, and certainly you can speak to the individual about as well, are the circumstances surrounding the offending behaviour. Was the individual undergoing periods of extreme hardship or suffering from poor mental health? Were they involved with drug abuse or substance misuse at the time? What were the circumstances that led them to receiving that conviction? And it's important to establish that because they may no longer be relevant in terms of the job role that they are going to be carrying out. Again, that's something you can discuss with the individual. And finally, is there any evidence of rehabilitation? Is there any evidence that the individual has changed their ways? So, can you see evidence of any drug counselling or any evidence of no recent offending on that person's certificate? You can also get sufficient references as well from other organizations that might demonstrate that the person has changed their behavior. So, there are other things that you can get to understand whether that individual has changed their ways, and then you can then think about them in their role, and whether you need to carry out a risk assessment to determine whether that individual is still suitable to carry out the role that you are recruiting for. But this is all information that can help you to understand more about the situation and about that information that it has been disclosed. And again, it should never be seen as a pass or fail, but take that information alongside other safer recruitment practices to make that informed decision. So one thing we are often asked by organisations in terms of the information that's been disclosed is, if an individual receives a conviction or police information becomes available after the certificate has been issued, how, as a recruitment manager, would you know about that information? And that is what the DBS update service is there to provide. So the DBS update service is free for volunteers, and for paid positions it costs £13 a year. An applicant can then register their DBS certificate online. Note there that if anyone is interested in the update service and they were going to register, they have to do it within 28 days of receiving their DBS certificate. So whatever the issue date is on the DBS certificate, within 28 days, that's the time frame they have to register with the update service. After that, if they don't register with the update service, they would only be able to do so when they apply for a new DBS certificate. But once they are registered with the update service, this means that regular checks can be carried out on the certificate to make sure that the information on there is still valid and still up to date since the date the certificate was issued. So this helps organisations to support their safeguarding measures, because it allows the recruitment manager or the employer to check online free of charge, and as long as they have the individual's consent, they can check to see that the DBS certificate that somebody is showing them is still valid and still up to date. So the certificate has to be at a level that you as an employer are able to check, and for the correct workforce. So for example, if you are recruiting an individual to carry out work with children, and for that role they need an enhanced DBS with a children's barred list check, if the applicant tells you that they already have a check at that level and it is registered with the DBS update service, then rather than having to apply for a brand new DBS check at the same level, you as a volunteer recruitment manager can check online, check the DBS update service to see if that certificate is still up to date. So that means that you are able to use it without having to apply for a brand new one. So as an organisation, when you do make that check online, the information that is on a DBS certificate will never be displayed on an update service. On the update service, you will literally just get a status update. So you may be told that no new information exists or no relevant information. So this means that there is no further intelligence, whether that's from the police national computer or from the police intelligence themselves. There is no new information to add onto that DBS certificate. So that DBS certificate is still valid and still up to date. You could be told that new information does exist, in which case that means that since the certificate has been issued, new information has become available. So that will let you know that the certificate you have is no longer up to date. And if that does happen, it is good practice to have a conversation with the applicant and let them know that you will be applying for a brand new DBS check to see what that new information is. Finally, if you're told that there is no record of the certificate, it could be because they've given you the wrong login details, or perhaps they haven't kept up to date with their subscription payments. But the main benefits of the DBS update service is that it allows you to recheck whenever you need to, and as long as you have the individual's consent, you can make sure that that certificate is still valid and up to date. So for those organisations that may carry out a renewal or a recheck every year or every 3 years or more than that, for those organisations, it may be something that they may want to consider, because the results are instant. You will just know by logging online whether that DBS updates, whether that DBS certificate is still valid and still up to date. In terms of the DBS update service, it is checked against Police National Computer and the barred list on a weekly basis, and it will check against any new relevant police information every 9 months. So, as I said, if you are an organisation that regularly checks or renews DBS certificates, then this is another way of keeping on track of that. That there is the update service. So now let's have a look at, we've looked at all the different levels of DBS checks, and we've spoken about what to do if you find information on, if there is information on a DBS certificate. But and even how to keep up to date with DBS certificates as well. But let's have a little look now at what level of DBS check. Is there any, sorry, if we just have our mics on mute, that'd be really great, thank you. So thinking about the different levels of DBS checks and determining what level of DBS check you are able to apply for, there are 5 things to think about. So the first is who your organization provides services for. So do you provide services for children or adults, or possibly even both? What the role involves. So what activities is that person going to be carrying out, and what will they actually get to be responsible for in that job role? How often is that role being performed? So for certain levels of DBS checks, it's not just about what activities they are carrying out, but they also need to be carrying them out often enough to be eligible for a certain level of DBS check. So how often they carry out that activity is important. When you need to consider if it is supervised work. So again, for some levels of DBS checks, if an individual is carrying out certain activity, but there is somebody else who's responsible for supervising that person as they carry out that activity, this can change the level of DBS check that they may be eligible for. And finally, we have where. Where is the role being performed? So in legislation, there are certain scenarios where an individual might not be eligible based on the activities that they are doing, but they could be eligible based on where the role is being performed, and these are called specified establishments. So we're going to look now at the who, basically. So the first thing to consider is the who the person will be working with in the course of their employment. So for what we're going to look at in the next few slides, basically, is what would allow somebody eligibility for the enhanced or the enhanced with barred list check. So and that's going to be the different that's going to be the DBS checks that we will focus on. As we said already, for the standard DBS check, they are for very, very specific roles, and for the basic DBS checks, there is no eligibility. So we're going to focus our attention now on when is it that you can apply for an enhanced or an enhanced with barred list check. So the first thing was who the person will be working with in the course of employment. So from a DBS perspective, we have 3 different workforces. So work with children is the child workforce, work with adults is the adult workforce, and everything else comes under the other workforce. So we're not going to really cover the other workforce today, but that usually includes roles like taxi licensing, security licensing, roles that are associated with the gambling and the Gambling Commission, those who are employed for purposes of national security and services of the Crown, those types of roles come under the other workforce. And if anyone is interested to learn more about the other workforce, there is a lot of information on our DBS website that you'll be welcome to have a look at. So let's first look at children. And for DBS purposes, a child is a person who has not yet reached the age of 18. So this table here helps us to decide what activity is technically regulated activity when working with children. And regulated activity is what makes somebody eligible for that enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. So as we mentioned previously, what is the activity? How often is it being carried out? And is it supervised? So we'll go through this table and we'll break it down into a little bit more detail. So the first example, sorry, excuse me. The first example we have is providing healthcare. Now, this can be any type of healthcare. My apologies. This can be any type of healthcare that is provided by a healthcare professional or someone who's acting under their direction or supervision. So anyone who is providing any type of healthcare at all, it only has to be carried out once for it to be regulated activity with children. Providing personal care, again, only has to be carried out once as well to be regulated activity with children, and therefore eligible for that enhanced with children's barred list check. So I'm just going to have a quick sip of water. Give me 2 seconds. Apologies, I think my water went down the wrong way, so all good. Right, so providing healthcare and providing personal care. So personal care is where help is providing with eating and drinking because the child is very young, or they may be ill, or they have a disability. So it can include things like helping with toileting, washing and dressing. So providing healthcare and providing personal care if it is it only has to be carried out once for it to be regulated activity with children, and therefore eligible for that enhanced DBS with children's partners check. The teaching, training and instruction of children and the caring for or supervision of children. If this is an unsupervised activity, it has to happen more than 3 days in a 30-day period or once overnight with the opportunity for contact between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and then it is regulated activity and therefore eligible for that enhanced DBS with children's partners check. The supervision element here is quite important because if the individual is supervised, then the employer may judge that the employee or the volunteer is not in regulated activity and that they may only be eligible for that enhanced DBS check. But it is the employer that has to make that suitability decision because they are the ones that can understand what kind of supervision is needed for that particular role. But if it is unsupervised and it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period or one night, then it is regulated activity with children. Providing advice or guidance for physical, emotional or educational well-being. Again, if it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period or once overnight, then it is regulated activity with children. Driving children under arrangement has to occur more than 3 days in a 30-day period, and then it would be regulated activity with children. Now, this cannot be a personal arrangement. So, for example, parents swapping the school run, that would not be regulated activity in that situation. If a third party or it is professionally driving children under arrangement and it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period, then that would be regulated activity. Moderating an online web service, again, has to happen more than 3 days in a 30-day period. The web service can be mostly or wholly for the purposes of children. So, the main thing is that if the moderator has access to the content that's being discussed in the chat room and has the opportunity to speak directly to the children, then that is regulated activity. And that can also be other types of digital contact too. So it could also include a helpline or other types of virtual communication. Registering to be a childminder and registering to be a foster carer, these are both regulated activity too. And another thing to mention here is the day-to-day managers of people who are in regulated activity, they themselves would also be eligible for the same level of DBS check. So anyone who manages somebody in regulated activity, so for example, if somebody is managing somebody who has an enhanced DBS with a children's partners check as their line manager, they would also be able to access that same level of DBS check as well. And as a final note, the rules are slightly different for those who are aged between 16 and 17 and are in employment or volunteering to work. So if a 16 or 17-year-old is volunteering, then whoever is supervising them would not be in regulated activity because that 16 or 17-year-old is there volunteering to work. For example, if somebody as well is receiving an activity such as teaching and training, for example, if somebody is on an apprenticeship, you've got a 16 or 17-year-old who is doing an apprenticeship where they are receiving teaching and training in the workplace, whoever is supervising them, they would not be in regulated activity. But say if the student also has to attend a college to receive training at the college as part of their apprenticeship, then whoever is teaching and training them at the college, they would be in regulated activity. So it does depend on where that is. So for 16 and 17-year-olds, the rules are slightly different. But for 16 and 17-year-olds, if they are in employment, then they would not, whoever is supervising them or teaching and training them would not be in regulated activity. So that is regulated activity with children, and that is what allows somebody access to that enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. So one thing I did mention as well earlier was specified establishments. So this allows us to consider whether someone is working somewhere, which means that they are in regulated activity with children. So this is all outlined in legislation and includes schools, nurseries, children's homes, childcare premises, and a few more. So if someone is working in one of these establishments, but they're not doing any of the activities that we just saw in the previous slide, then they may be in regulated activity if they can satisfy the following criteria. If they work there for more than 3 days in a 30-day period or overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., they have the opportunity for contact with the children in the establishment while they are there. they work for the purpose of the establishment and it's not a temporary or an occasional role or a supervised volunteer role, then that person would be in regulated activity and eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check. So a classic example of this is a school caretaker. So a permanent caretaker who is in the school 5 days a week. They are on the school premises during the hours that children are present, so they have that opportunity for contact. They work there for the purpose of the establishment because they are looking after the school, and as long as they are a permanent member of staff, that school caretaker would be eligible for an enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check, and that's based on where they work. So that's the where there. So that's regulated activity. There are a few other situations where there is work with children, but it's not regulated activity. So that means that because it's not regulated activity, they would not be able to access that enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check, but they may be able to access the enhanced DBS check on its own. So we have a few examples. So if somebody is supervised whilst they are teaching, instructing, caring for, or supervising children, they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check only. So again, that supervision element is really important to consider, because if they are supervised and they're doing one of those activities, then they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check only. Similarly, even if they're supervised when they're working in a specified establishment, because of that supervision, they would only be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. And again, it is the line manager or the employer who is responsible for ensuring or determining what level of supervision is required. Anyone that is carrying out regulated activity, but not often enough, they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. So where you saw, for example, teaching and training more than 3 days in a 30-day period, say, for example, it was only 1 day in a 30-day period, they would not be eligible for that enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check, but they would be eligible for the enhanced DBS check on its own. Living or working childminding or childcare premises, this would be eligible for an enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check. So this is the exception on this as well, alongside, alongside another one in a second. But essentially, because the individual is living or working in a place where children are being cared for, they would be eligible for that enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check. And that's obviously often quite important for those if you are a partner of somebody who runs childcare premises out of your home, for example, then the partner and any children over the age of 16 would be eligible for that enhanced DBS with a children's barred-list check. If you are a trustee of a children's charity, you would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. So the children's charity would have to be mostly, fully, or wholly for children, and they would be carrying out regulated activity with children as part of the activities that they offer. So trustees of those charities would be eligible for enhanced DBS check. And finally, registering to be an adoptive parent as well. This would be eligible for enhanced DBS with the children's barred-list check too. So that is everything I want to discuss in terms of regulated activity with children. I'm just trying to think, is now a good place for a quick break, or shall we go and finish adults first? If everyone's okay to carry on, or yeah, okay, we'll carry on. Right, we'll have a look at adults, and what I'll do is I'll give you a quick comfort break, literally.
I think there's one request for a break, Kiran.
Oh, okay, cool, that's fine. No problem at all. If we, that's fine. Do you want to take a few minutes and then should we come back at 11:20? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll see you both back at 11:20. Thank you, Noika. Right, so now we're going to look at work with adults. And for DBS purposes, an adult is a person who is aged 18 or over. So in the adult workforce, we've got a table here as well, similarly how we did for the children, that outlines what is regulated activity with adults. So what activities does an individual have to be doing to be eligible for an enhanced DBS with an adult's barred-list check? So the main difference you may notice between this table and the table that we just saw for children and regulated activity is that for working with adults in regulated activity, there is no period condition that has to be met. They only have to be doing these activities once to be eligible for an enhanced DBS with the adults barred list check, because carrying out any of these activities once is regulated activity with adults. So providing healthcare to adults is regulated activity if it's being provided to adults by or under the direction or supervision of a healthcare professional. That is regulated activity with adults. Similarly, providing personal care to adults, that is also regulated activity if it's concerned with the washing or dressing of those adults, or assisting them with the eating, drinking, or toileting because of their age, illness, or disability. They would be eligible for that enhanced DBS with the adults barred list check. Providing social work to adults is also regulated activity, and that's if it's been provided by a social care worker to an adult who is already a client or a potential client. Another example is assistance with the day-to-day financial running of an adult's own household. So this includes managing the adult's cash, paying their bills, or carrying out their shopping. That is regulated activity with adults. If somebody has been employed or recruited to volunteer on behalf of an organization to carry out those activities. So it's just to make another note here that this activity, along with the others, if they are carried out as part of a personal arrangement, so for example, your neighbor who does the shopping for their neighbor because they are a good neighbor, that would not be regulated activity. Like I said, somebody has to be employed or volunteering on behalf of an organization to be carrying out those activities. And that's because that suitability decision has to be made. But yes, otherwise, if somebody is employed or recruited to volunteer to help with the day-to-day financial running of an adult's own household, that is regulated activity. We also have the assistance with the conduct of an adult's affairs, and that is regulated activity too. So that refers to those individuals who have been given power of attorney over another adult, or people who have been appointed as a deputy, and that's under the mental health orders or the court of protection. That is regulated activity. And the final example we have is conveying an adult. So that means transporting an adult or moving them around. So it's not specific to a vehicle, but it could mean helping to transport an adult around in a wheelchair, for example. But conveying an adult is regulated activity with adults, and it has to be for health, personal, or social care reasons, again, due to the adult's age, illness, or disability. So carrying out any of these activities once would mean that that individual is in regulated activity with adults. And for regulated activity, again, it's important to remember that anyone who is responsible for the day-to-day management of someone who is in regulated activity, they themselves would also be eligible for that same level of DBS check. And in this case, that would be an enhanced DBS with the adults barred list check. So there is a lot of work as well that will be carried out with adults, but that is not regulated activity. So that means that that person would not be eligible for an enhanced DBS with an adults barred list check, but they could still be eligible for an enhanced DBS check on its own. The rules are set out in legislation, and the DBS have produced an adult workforce guide to help organisations determine what an individual's eligibility is when they are in work with adults that is not regulated activity. All that information is available on our DBS website. So on this slide here, now we will go through what are the 3 steps that you have to consider for this level of eligibility. So the first thing to think about is who is the adult who is receiving the activity. The adult has to be aged 18 or over, and they have to be receiving what's known as a listed health or social care service or a listed activity. And we've got lots of information on exactly what that means on our website, but as an example, those living in residential accommodation for care or nursing, those living in sheltered housing, if somebody is being provided with care or assistance because of their age, illness, or disability, that could be in their own home or the place where they live, and anyone who is detained in prison or being detained in a remand centre or removal centre as well. And there are other examples as well, but that was just some. So the first thing is to understand that the adult that is receiving the service is receiving a listed health or social care service or listed activity. Step 2 is looking at what the individual who has been employed or recruited to provide to the adults in step 1. So the employee or the volunteer could be doing any one of these activities in that step 2 box. So they could be providing them with teaching, training, or instruction. They could be providing them with assistance, advice, or guidance. They could be caring for the adults or supervising them. They could be providing them with any form of treatment or therapy, or moderating a public interactive electronic communication service like a panic alarm. It also includes work that's carried out in a care home, and also includes driving adults under contractual arrangements. So if step 1 and step 2 are met, then the final thing to think about is how often that activity is being carried out. So for this level of check, often enough is more than 3 days in the 30-day period, once a week on an ongoing basis, or overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. with the opportunity for contact. So if all 3 steps are met, then that individual is in work with adults and they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check only. So an example of this could be a yoga instructor that visits a care home every week. So the yoga instructor is visiting those adults who are receiving a listed health or social care service, because living in a residential accommodation, care or nursing is a listed health or social care service. They are teaching and training them on how to do yoga. So that is step 2 met. And if they're attending and visiting once a week, that is once a week on an ongoing basis. That is step 3 carried out. So that yoga instructor is in work with adults, and that yoga instructor would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check only. And there's a few other examples as well of what is work with adults. Now, these are particular roles that have been outlined in legislation, and they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. So trustees of adults charities. So if they are charities that are wholly or mainly for adults who are in receipt of health or social care services or illicit activity, so, and the services that they provide are considered to be work with adults, then those trustees would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. Specific positions in England and Wales, so that includes CQC inspectors, they would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. And essentially anyone who carries out work with adults would also be in work with adults as well and eligible for that same level of DBS check. So those are just a few other roles that have been outlined in legislation as also being in work with adults and therefore eligible for that enhanced DBS check. Just to mention, obviously, with the trustees as well, if it was a trustees of an adults charity that was delivering or providing regulated activity with adults, again, those trustees would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS check as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover in terms of regulated activity with children and adults. So I'm just going to, next what we're going to do is go through some scenarios. So I've got a few situations here, and please feel free to either take yourselves off mute and let me know what level of DBS check you think these individuals would be appropriate for these individuals, or if you want to add it in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Noyoka, you can keep an eye on that and let me know what people are saying. So here we go. So the first one is Sophia. So Sophia volunteers with her local neighbourhood association group. Her role is to deliver food parcels to local residents. Some of those residents may have health and social care needs. Any thoughts on Sophia and what level of check she should be eligible for?
Basic.
Absolutely, yes. No, you're correct. Yeah. So Sophia would be eligible for a basic check only. As you can see, delivering food parcels is not an activity that is considered to be regulated activity, nor is it work with adults. She is literally just dropping food parcels off. And the key thing there to remember is some of those residents may have health and social care needs, not all of them. If Sophia's role changed in any way and she was going to be working specifically, for example, with people who are living in sheltered accommodation, and she was going to deliver food parcels to only those who live in sheltered accommodation, then Sophia could be in work with adults, and then Sophia would be eligible for that enhanced DBS check. But just based on delivering food parcels to the general population, of which some may have health and social care needs, it is just a basic check. Absolutely, Christine. Right, the next example is Joshua. So he is a volunteer telephone befriender with a charity that supports older adults. He telephones and speaks to adults that are bedbound, housebound, or on a weekly basis. Any thoughts on Joshua and what level of check he could get?
We've got basic for that as well.
Yes, that is basic, absolutely. We often get queries about befriender roles, and I know that it can be quite tricky, but from a DBS perspective, if they are just telephoning an adult to help them with loneliness and to, you know, to check up on them, then essentially that is still just a basic check. Even if Joshua was going to pop in to the older adults' houses and make them a cup of tea, again, he's making a cup of tea, he's having a chat with them, again, that would still only be eligible for a basic DBS check. If Joshua's role changes in the sense that he's still a telephone befriender, but he's also offering advice and guidance, then things could change, because potentially then you could be looking at work with adults. Again, if he's offering advice and guidance to those who are in receipt of health or social care services, and by the sounds of it, he is speaking to adults that are bedbound or housebound, so potentially they will probably be receiving health or social care services, then you could say that Joshua could be in work with adults. But just based on this itself, it would just...
Can I interrupt here? Because we just had one of our ECT does our DBS checks for us, and there was a big issue about whether telephone befrienders, because they do give advice, and that's what their whole job is, their role is, not just to just have a chat. They do give advice, they help them with computer, the IT, all that sort of thing. And there's a big hoo-ha about whether they should be basic or not. And at the moment, all our telephone befrienders are basic DBS checks.
Right, so, okay. Yeah, so it all depends on, I'll be honest, it all depends on what is in that, is in the job title when you're making those DBS applications. So a lot of people are just saying befriender, then a lot of, then often the umbrella body will say, okay, well, that is a basic check. The key is in making sure that the eligibility is in the job title, if that makes sense. So for example, if it is more advice and guidance, then maybe it's an advice and guidance
telephone befriender.
Advice
and guidance, telephone befriender.
So so that when the umbrella body looks at that application, they can see where that eligibility is.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Christine, if you want to have a little chat about that outside of this, more than happy to do so. Yeah, brilliant. Next we've got Danny. So Danny is a volunteer at a local park museum. He attends to the reception and also helps in the cafe when times are busy. Any thoughts on Danny?
Park museum. Basic again?
Yeah, no, it is a basic check. So a lot of people sometimes feel that, okay, well, although he's just working in a local park museum, but he speaks to children and he speaks to vulnerable adults, you know, is there any eligibility there? And really there isn't. You know, his role is to attend to reception and help in the cafe. And yes, although he may speak to children and vulnerable adults, that's not his role. So his role, based on his role, his DBS check would be a basic check. Next, we have Emma. So she is a volunteer at a COVID vaccination centre. She has an auxiliary role, so she provides admin and stewarding support. Any thought on Emma?
Let someone else answer.
So Emma would actually be eligible for a standard DBS check, and that's because her role is in connection with the provision of healthcare, and she has the opportunity for contact with those in receipt of health services. So that particular role, where you are in connection with the provision of healthcare and you have opportunity for contact, that is a particular role that is in the standard DBS check guidelines. So for that particular reason, she would be eligible for a standard DBS check, but she doesn't actually administer any of the vaccinations. She's not providing healthcare. She's just there for that stewarding support. And the final one we have is Thomas. So Thomas is a trustee for a children's support charity. The charity provides services such as teaching, training children with learning disabilities and autism to play sports. Any thoughts on Thomas? I think absolutely, yeah, absolutely enhanced. So the charity is involved in the teaching, training of children. So they are providing regulated activity. Thomas is a trustee of that charity, and therefore Thomas would be eligible for that enhanced DBS check, and that's without the barred list. If, for example, the charity did not provide regulated activity, or perhaps it's just thinking about a different charity completely that does not provide regulated activity, then the role of the trustee would only be eligible for a basic DBS check. So that's everything there in terms of disclosure, and a few examples there for you. So I hope that's been helpful. We'll very quickly go through barring, and then we could, if there's any questions, then I'll be happy to answer them. So Barring is, as I mentioned, obviously a big part of what the DBS does. This is where we can look at whether an individual should be allowed to work in that particular workforce, whether that's been with children's workforce or in the adults workforce. And if an individual is barred, then they are no longer allowed to work with that in that particular workforce. So there are three ways that the DBS can receive barring referrals. We have discretionary referrals, which is when someone contacts the DBS directly because they have concerns that an individual may have harmed a child or vulnerable adult or put a child or vulnerable adult at harm or risk. So these referrals come directly from employers, agencies, keepers of registrars, and supervisory authorities. Next, we have the auto bar referral route. So this is where someone is convicted of or cautioned for an automatic inclusion offence. So again, these are very serious offences that have already been set out in law, which require the DBS to bar an individual from regulated activity in that relevant workforce. Then the final route is a disclosure information route. So this is when information comes to light because an individual has applied for an enhanced check against one or both barred lists. Because the individual is looking to work in regulated activities, if the police national computer identifies particular information that is of concern, then that application can go back to barring for consideration as to whether that individual should be working with that workforce or not. For all three routes of referrals, the individual who has been referred does have the opportunity for representation, and that's where they can give their view and their side of the story. And representations are an important part of making fair, consistent, and thorough barring decisions. So we have to make sure we give the individual an opportunity to say their part as well. So who has a legal duty to refer? So legislation has basically said that if you are a regulated activity provider, so you are an employer or a voluntary organisation who is responsible for the management and control of regulated activity, and you employ people to work in regulated activity, you would have a legal duty to make a referral. Legislation has also said that if you are an employment agency or an employment business or an educational institution that makes arrangements with other employers or organizations to supply individuals to them that will then undertake regulated activity, they also have a legal duty to make a referral. But the big question that we often get asked is, when should you be making a referral? So you should be making a referral to the DBS when two conditions have been met. So the first condition is that you have withdrawn permission for that individual to engage in regulated activity. So that could be through a dismissal, they're redeployed to another area of the business that isn't in regulated activity. They could have retired, taken redundancy, or they have just resigned themselves. And the second condition is that you think that the person has either engaged in relevant conduct, satisfied the harm test, or received a caution or conviction for a relevant offence. So what we mean by engage in relevant conduct is that harm has directly been caused. Somebody has directly harmed somebody in their care, or potentially not in their care, but certainly someone that the organisation provides a service for, but harm has directly occurred, and that could be any type of harm, physical, sexual, verbal, neglect, any type of harm. Satisfied the harm test means that harm has not yet directly occurred, but there are serious concerns that harm could occur in the future. And that could be because of the way the individual is conducting themselves, the way they are behaving, potentially even the way they are talking about things and what they are saying. There is a concern that harm could occur in the future. So for example, if someone has disclosed to a colleague that they have thoughts of a sexual nature about the children in their care, that would satisfy the harm test, because although harm has not yet occurred, there is a concern that harm could occur in the future. So essentially, if you have withdrawn permission, if you remove somebody from regulated activity following a belief that they have caused harm or they could cause harm in the future, or because they have received a conviction or caution for relevant offence, then a referral to the DBS should be made and it should be made basically, and the duty to refer certainly exists for those regulated activity providers and those personnel suppliers. Just very quickly though, I just want to mention that often we hear reasons on why people didn't make a referral to the DBS. So for example, people say, well, we approached the individual and we spoke about those concerns and they resigned, so we didn't think we needed to make that referral anymore. So the main reason why these conditions are in place is because, yes, that individual resigned, but that individual could go elsewhere and they could volunteer with another organisation, and that risk will still exist. And that's why it's important that if you do find yourself in that position where you have removed somebody from regulated activity, following a belief that they have caused harm or they could cause harm in the future, you should be making that referral to the DBS. Another thing we often get told is that the police were involved and the police decided to take no further action, so we didn't think the DBS could do anything. Well, actually, the threshold that the police use to take any further action or to convict somebody is different to the DBS. So just because the police have decided to take no further action does not mean that the DBS would not bar that individual. The police have a beyond reasonable doubt threshold, whereas the DBS have a different, which has completely gone out of my mind. It's a balance of probabilities threshold, so it's more likely than not to have occurred. So because our thresholds are different, please bear in mind that just because the police have taken no further action doesn't mean that the DBS would not bar the individual. So those are the two conditions that have to be met for a referral to be made. Now, a referral can be made online using our borrowing portal, or we also have the DBS referral forms available in Word and PDF formats that you can download or print off and complete, and then either post them to us or email them to us. But ultimately, what does a good quality referral look like? So just to bear in mind that the DBS do not have any investigatory powers. We can't go knocking people's doors and ask them to give us everything that they have about an individual. All our decisions are based on the referral and the information and evidence that comes along with the referral. So that's why it's really important to try and make that referral as clear and as comprehensive and full of information that can help us make our decision. So in terms of what does a good quality referral look like? So what we say in the first instance is make sure your referral is timely. So balance the need for a swift response with the need for sufficient documentary or supporting evidence. So it's about knowing and understanding about when you can make that referral to the DBS, knowing when you've got enough evidence to make that referral to the DBS, but to also balance the risk of that individual still potentially working with other vulnerable groups while this process is progressing as well. So it is about making sure you do balance that. Accurate and fully completed referral forms. So if there are any gaps, please do let us know why they are there, if you can. Make sure that the referral is chronological, so detail the events from the very beginnings of the concerns to the final outcomes or the end result or the investigation conclusion. We don't need to know when the individual started and how things were going well. We don't need to know all that. We want to know when things started being a concern, and even if it's those low-level concerns. Provide us with as much relevant information as you can. So that includes details of the victim or the potential victim, what harm was caused. You can include details of obviously the victim's age and why they are viewed as vulnerable, and be explicit as you can when you are describing what's happened. So you can give us as much information that as you can, so that we can help, so we can use that information to make that decision-making process. Training and supervision records and any internal and external investigative and disciplinary processes, these are all very, very valuable as well. So you can include interviews, any notes that you have from the police, if you have any minutes from any meetings that were carried out, any records or documents that you can provide to us that will help us to understand what the situation was as much as possible. That all helps to make a good quality referral. If you don't have access to any information, tell us who does have it and we can always ask them. But the main thing is, if you don't tell us about that information, we won't know it exists. But essentially, a borrowing referral with as much detail and information on as possible helps our caseworkers to decide whether that referred individual should be barred from working in regulated activity or not. And if somebody is found to be barred, and the DBS have decided to bar that particular individual from working in that workforce, what does that mean? So if an individual is placed on the children's barred list, then that means they are not allowed to engage in regulated activity with children in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. If they are placed on an adult barred list, then that means that they are not allowed to engage in regulated activity with vulnerable adults in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the bars for both children and adults also applies to regulated work in Scotland too. It is a criminal offence to work, seek work or offer to work in regulated activity when you are barred on the relevant list. And it is also a criminal offence for a person to permit an individual they know or have reason to believe is barred from regulated activity to engage in regulated activity as well. So it's very important that we do adhere and understand what those barred lists mean. And a final thought, if you don't make a referral to the DBS, who will? If you don't make a referral to the DBS, how will we know? If you don't make a referral to the DBS, the person may go on to cause further harm to a vulnerable adult or child. If you do make a referral to the DBS, then we will consider all the evidence when deciding whether that person should be barred, and we will only ever bar them from working in vulnerable groups if it is the appropriate and proportionate thing to do. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip this slide, and what I'll do is I'll send that information to you in there anyway. But we do have lots of information available on our website, and that you are welcome to access and view. We've also got, I'll also make sure obviously these slides are shared, so you'll also have the useful links as well. But essentially, just to come back to my role, so as I mentioned earlier, I am the DBS Regional Outreach Advisor for Greater London. So essentially, if you have any questions at all to do with anything that we discussed already or anything that we didn't discuss, if you have any questions about DBS eligibility, or potentially if a situation has occurred and you're not sure if a referral should be made to the DBS or not, more than welcome to make contact with me. I'm more than happy to speak to you and support you through that. Obviously, this was an overview of the DBS services, but if you feel that you go back to your organisations and, for example, your organisation would like to know more about the barring side of what the DBS does, more than happy for you to get in contact with me, and we can arrange a similar workshop, but that focuses more on barring. But essentially, if you know, or to do with anything basically in terms of the DBS. But if you do feel that your organisation would like more support or could do with understand or have any questions about the DBS, more than welcome to contact me. But that's me basically. So my contact details are there as well, as long with other teams and departments in the DBS that may be of use as well to you. As always, your feedback is very, very important to us. So if you do have a few minutes, I would really appreciate it if you could just click on the link and complete a very quick and short evaluation form. We need to know that how we can improve these sessions as well. So as much information as you can give us would be great. And that is it from me. So I'm just conscious of time. So I wanted to make sure that we have time for a few questions. So I hope that's okay. I'm going to stop sharing. Yes. I don't know if there was anything on the chat.
There was just one question, but I'm not sure if it's already answered because you did touch on that topic. But I will check with Mr. Mukesh Malhotra if he needs further clarity on that. Is there an appeal process if something is flagged during the DBS process, especially for the enhanced level?
Sorry, does he want to clarify that a bit more? If something is flagged on an enhanced DBS check when it's being processed.
Mukesh, welcome today. Lovely
Hello
to see
there.
you. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, the reason why I was asking the question is that if, say, for example, something nominal came up, you probably kind of put it to one side. But if something came up on the enhanced side, does the individual who you've done the DBS check on, do they have the right of appeal if you decide that you decide not going to give them the job or you remove them from the job?
Oh, okay, right. So you've received the DBS certificate and there is information on it that is concerning, and you feel that you're not going to give them the role.
Yep, that's right.
So in terms of that, I mean, certainly if you have your own policies and procedures that outline, so for example, obviously, as I mentioned, that CQC and Ofsted, they have certain restrictions on the roles that they regulate. So if somebody receive. For example, if somebody has and I don't know exactly what those restrictions are, but for Ofsted, for example, if you have a conviction against a child, then they will probably not consider you for a particular role that they regulate. That's just an example. That's not definite. But so for some organisations, if there is information on a DBS certificate that is relevant to the role and it is of a concern, then certainly you do have, you are in a position where you can say to that individual that you won't be taking on employment or their volunteering opportunity with you because of the information. And I think that's the whole point of a DBS certificate, though, because it would, if you were to have information on a DBS certificate that you put an action on, then it would be a bit difficult to kind of justify why we exist. But that's why that information is there. But certainly from your own perspective, like you can check your own organisation's policies, your own safer recruitment policies, and your recruitment of ex-offenders policies as well, to justify why if an individual has a particular conviction or caution or concerning information on their DBS certificate, how you will then take further process with that application. But as long as it's documented and outlined, then you are protected in that way. But for further clarity on how you can do that, we would advise you to seek legal advice.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I see a hand by Hassan from Miles.
I would like to say thank you. I really appreciate that. But the question I ask is a practical question. It's when the people they apply, for example, the people who working and the people who are doing volunteer, it's different prices. Or can you just explain to me which the category to, for example, the one is hands and the one is a basic one, and they have a different cost, or is it most of them they are similar?
Yeah. So for volunteers, for volunteers, the standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred list check, they would be free. But just to point on that, obviously, a lot of organisations will be using umbrella bodies, and umbrella bodies may put on their own admin charges or their join-up fees. So although they're free from a DBS perspective, there may be a few additional costs. But if a volunteer needed a basic check, there would be a charge for that as well, because the basic check is eligible for anybody and there are no requirements to it. For a basic check, a volunteer would have to pay for that, or the organisation recruiting the volunteer would be paying for that. In terms of paid staff, obviously the basic, standard, enhanced, and enhanced with barred list check, there would be a charge for all of those. Did I say Hassan?
I think this Hassan joined us a bit later, and I think there's a slide on the charges also in the presentation, which I will be sharing. We have Pauline Bennett, who's working on the yellow book for all of us in the for all the VCSs in Ealing, and thank you, Pauline, for joining us today. If there's anything specific that you need added into that yellow book with regards to DBS, which might not have been in the previous book, or if there's any further information that you'd like there, do send me an email, connect with Pauline or anybody, and we try and incorporate that, because we're in the process of finalizing the final stages of the book. Any more questions for Kiran? I think it's Manraj now. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the workshop, first of all. Can I just ask, would it be appropriate for us to enroll someone in a traineeship, apprenticeship, knowing that the role would lead to a position working with children or vulnerable people, knowing that they've come back with a DBS that may be flagged for this sort of work?
Right, so if you've employed somebody on an apprenticeship in the first instance, and then later on the role changes?
No, if it's more like, if let's say we're training someone to work with children, but our purpose potentially is just training them up. While they're with us, employed with us or enrolled with us, it wouldn't be working with kids. It's just giving them the opportunity to train up to a position where they could. And then it's up to the schools afterwards, I would say, to deal
Right.
with that DBS.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So if you are teaching and training them to work, then whoever is supervising or teaching them or training them would not be in regulated activity if it's in the workplace. But as part of that apprenticeship, for example, if they have to go to a college as well, is that what would happen potentially?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, so if they have to go to a college, whoever is teaching and training them there, they would be in regulated activity and they would be eligible for that higher level of
Okay.
enhanced.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense? Because it's difficult when it comes to 16 and 17-year-olds, because technically from 16 years old, everyone can work.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's just bearing that in mind. So if they are 16 years old and above, and they are doing this for work purposes, the work element of it, that will not be considered to be regulated activity. But if they are still training and teaching in an education environment, like a college, then that would be regulated activity.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, please feel free to contact me if you've got more specifics about it. No problem at all.
Thank you.
No problem.
Any further questions for Kiran? I would be putting in a link for feedback. As you all run projects, you know the importance of feedback to your projects. It's very important for us to gather feedback for the session as well as Kiran. I think, do you have a separate link in your presentation, or is it the same one I sent you?
No, I have a separate link.
Okay, so I'll be sharing that also. So do take that minute out and give us that feedback. It will help us bring more effective sessions to you. Also, if you have any specific training needs, any specific training that you'd like, do send me an email and I'll try and work and get that a relevant or authorized person to come to you with the information that you're looking for. And I know I've learned a lot in this session today. So thank you so much, Kiran, again for your time. And it has been a very informative session. I have just one question before you go. I do understand that, there is a time gap, or is this a check that you do through the lifetime of a person, if the person were living in the UK? But for individuals who moved to the country a couple of years ago, how does that DBS check change? Or, do they need to get, some verification from back home? And how does this change? Because a lot of people are moving in and out of the country. So is there any change there?
So the DBS we can only access information about individuals who have lived in the UK. So for any individuals who've lived outside of the UK, sorry, let me rephrase that. And if they've spent time in the UK as well, that's the information we can access. For those individuals who have come from abroad, we do have a web page, which is basically dedicated to all the different organizations in the different countries. So that would basically come down to the employer having to contact those organizations and carrying out their equivalent check of a DBS in their country. So for some countries, they may do something similar to what we do. For some countries, they may do, I think it's called a reference of good conduct. It all varies, but essentially it comes down to the employer. But if that is useful, I can include that link when I send you the information.
Brilliant, yeah. I can share that around too.
Yeah, so it's just a case of, unfortunately, we can only do what we can do for those in this country. But if it's someone from outside, you are more than welcome to contact their embassies and they will have their own equivalents, basically. Not exact equivalent, but something similar.
Something similar. Thank you so much, Kiran. Yeah, I think that kind of answers it. In fact, it's something that I just came across recently and I thought this would be a good forum to check on it.
No problem.
Any final questions? Yes, Jatinder, go ahead.
Jatinder, okay, my question is, we run a day center and I'm a coordinator. What we do, all the elderly people comes, we give them exercise and a cup of tea and sometimes the presentation from outside the specialized people. do I need me and my staff to have a DBS check?
So it all depends on who exactly you are providing the service to. So the day centre, and is it for anybody who wants to come?
No, we don't do physical in touch with them. There's no physical there or able people. They
Okay.
come and have their seats, and I provide them exercise or some of our other volunteers and give them hot food, which is they are all able bodies.
Okay, so it might not be, so you're probably not delivering regulated activity, so it won't be it won't be the DBS with the adult barred list check, but depending on who exactly, so if if the service is for anybody who wants to come along, for the general public, so to speak, then you would only be eligible for a basic DBS check. But if you are providing for, say, for example, one of those sessions is for those people who live in sheltered accommodation and only they will come along, then you could be looking at being and work with adults because you're teaching them exercise and you're helping them to exercise. Then you could be looking at an enhanced DBS check. But Jacinda, if you want to contact me outside of this, I'll be more than happy to look at that in a little bit more detail for you.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
I will be sharing the slides, and which also has contact details for Kiran. If you're unable to, and you still have more questions and you are unable to reach Kiran, to send me an email. I'm happy to go ahead and pass that information to her. Thank you so much for your time today. 12:02. Let you have the rest of the day and take care.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.